Americans, when you travel from state to state, do you feel culture shock or do you feel like it's sort of the same culture, and why? I've lived in 6 states now, and crossed the country 4 times. Every once in a while you see more of a shocking situation, but it's rare. Like most have said, urban to rural is the big one. I went from Boston to a town of less than 1,000 in Alaska. That was a huge shock, but after settling in a bit you get used to things. I moved from Utah to Ohio. Let me tell you, moving from Utah to any state that doesn't border it is a culture shock in and of itself. The Mormon population drops from the overwhelming majority to almost non-existent. I've always gotten the impression Utah is the biggest culture shock in the country though. I'm from Florida, but like northern Florida near the capital. Something a lot of non-Floridians don't know is that in Florida, the further you go north is the further you go south. Basically the northern part is the most southern part and central and southern Florida are more big city metro vibes. People from different regions of the US always seem to be very fascinated with our accents. I went to Vegas for a few days and was asked where I was from several times. I personally don't have as strong of an accent as most people from my area because I went to speech classes growing up, but it made me aware that even though subtle, I have a uniquely Floridian southern accent. There's a culture difference between different regions, but the biggest culture difference in the US is between cities, suburbs, and rural areas. I grew up in a small town in Oregon and live in New York City, but if I drive 20-30 miles up I-87 the areas I see look a heck of a lot more like where I grew up than they do the city. There are some big differences between rural areas in Oregon. Waldport versus Yamhill versus Joseph will show some similarities. Only thing to do around there is drugs, but there are also some noticeable differences, primarily due to climate. Definitely not culture shock, but it's definitely a different vibe going from some cities or regions to others. The biggest difference to me is just going from a rural area to a city, but I think that can be said in general. Depends on how far you're going. Just heading one state over, not too much of a difference. Heading all the way across the country, definitely going to be some difference. The one exception in the Northeast is if you stay too long, you start to realize that Rhode Island is just freaking weird. Not visible for the first week or 2, but then you really start to question things like what the purpose of coffee milk actually is. Not the same shock as when I visited India or New Zealand or Russia, no. There are certainly regional differences and things you will notice, but uniform enough to not be glaring or startling. Well, I live in a smallish town in Texas and I went to New York City a few years ago. It was very different. There was so much to do there and the people there acted much differently too. Crap, you can get a culture shock inside of Texas. Beaumont native is going to stick out like a sore thumb in El Paso. My country is small, so I always wonder if Americans feel any different from state to state culturally or not, like I do traveling in general. Lived in Maine my entire life and haven't traveled too much out of it except when I was younger. So when I helped my sister-in-law and her 2 kids move out to San Diego area where my brother was stationed in the Navy, it was a huge shock. Going from a completely whitewashed state to an area where we as white peoples were more the minority was honestly shocking at first. Like I had no issues with it. It was just kind of, oh yeah, there is diversity outside of New England. I've lived in 5 states and have traveled to a lot. Huge culture shocks. I've lived in Utah, California, Texas, Idaho, and Washington. Huge changes in politics, religions, ways of life, rural versus urban. Washington is all about coffee, music, craft beer and hiking. California is well the glamour of Cali and the beach. Texas is very patriotic, but both California and Texas have a lot of Hispanic influences. Utah very small town feel, very friendly, but a lot of religious people. Idaho was very farm-y. Trucks, tractors, potatoes. Super small town. As a kid we just rode bikes around on roads that were 50 miles per hour. Running into a rattlesnake was no big deal. There are some things that are the same that I think people who've never traveled don't think about. Street signage follows the same rules across states. Everything's in the same language, same currency, same general norms in basic interaction. What can be different is lingo, accent, types of restaurant chains or specialty food you'll find, norms and values in human interaction and relationship. That sort of thing that comes out in deeper conversations or staying longer in one place. I've lived in upper Midwest, Atlantic South and West Coast and haven't experienced culture shock, at least not the way I did moving to Eastern Europe and living in Western Europe. There was some adjustment though, just in jargon language, rhythm of life. I found more difference in work life. East Coast has been accomplishment oriented yet more favorable to employees in work-life balance. Midwest was all about getting up early and hard work and employers thought you should just be happy to have a job. West Coast was more chill in attitude and generous with benefits but you're still working all night. I work in tech though, so mileage may vary, and work life is just a small example. Dead on about the Midwest work-life description. Depends what state you're from. California is a complete bubble, nothing like the other states. Heck, even if you go from a coastal city to a rural part of California you'll notice a difference. There's a culture difference from city to city within the same state, lol. Northern and Southern California also feel different. Even Southern California. I grew up behind the orange curtain and it was completely different from LA County or San Diego. Then there is the Inland Empire aka Valley of the Dirt People, aka M capital of the state. We don't talk about Imperial County. I feel like it's more regional for me. I'm from Colorado and Wyoming and Montana kinda have the same vibe along with most of the Rocky Mountain region. I definitely felt the most culture shock on the East Coast though. So yes, I feel some culture shock but to me it's all regional and not state by state. I agree with this. I grew up in Southern Appalachia. NC, TN, VA, SC all feel familiar in parts and more foreign in others. Now I live in the Northeast. And that was an adjustment, too. Geography matters more than state line. I was raised and live in the Pacific Northwest. My wife is from the Midwest. Every time we visit her family it is a culture shock to me. Some aspects are good and bad, but it is weird to think that it is the same country. The passive-aggressive sarcasm of the Midwest got me. I'm from Southern California and I used to work at a hotel's front desk. Everywhere you look, the people with the most menial jobs are Hispanic older women and men. Housekeepers are overwhelmingly Hispanic ladies. The first time I went to New Orleans, it felt weird seeing a white lady ask me if I needed more towels. I'm Hispanic myself and we definitely live in a bubble here. Sometimes there's actual culture shock within the same state. As a native of Western Pennsylvania, traveling to Eastern or even Central PA entails a weird change in culture mostly centered around what food I can find readily available. Here in Pittsburgh, nobody's ever heard of birch beer but over in Harrisburg, the stuff is everywhere. Same goes with things like Midlesworth potato chips, various restaurant chains, Hershey's ice cream, and supermarket chains that exist on the other half of the state, but don't exist here, like Wegmans, and vice versa, like Giant Eagle. It does give me a weird isn't this the same state feeling, and I'm having a difficult time articulating why the two halves of the same state feel so distinct from one another, even though I live here. Then you have the whole Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish culture, that simply stops existing on the western half of the state, but is absolutely everywhere to the east. How about the whole soda versus pop thing? If you were to check that old soda versus pop map, this state is divided right down the middle, with pop on the west and soda on the east. It's divided that way too for sports teams. Steelers, Penguins, Pirates to the west, Eagles, Flyers, Phillies to the east. It's divided that way for convenience stores. Sheetz on the west, Wawa on the east, and too many other weird little things to list. Even dialects and accents vary wildly between the two halves of this state. Take your average Joe from Philadelphia and a Yenza from Downton, Pittsburgh, and you'd think they were from two different countries. My theory about all of this is because there's a mountain range that divides our state in half, the Appalachians, and as they say, Pennsylvania feels like Pittsburgh on one end, Philadelphia on the other, and Alabama in between. Or Pennsylvania, as we call it, TLDR. Yes, there's culture shock between states, and sometimes within the same state. Pennsylvania is weird. The fact that you can drive an hour from America's 6th most populated city and be in communities that commute via horse and buggy always gets me. I've lived on the West Coast and the East Coast, New England, and there are differences. It wasn't a shock, but it felt off. Then I visited the Midwest, Plain States, and it was like I was in a different country. The dialect, the prices, the conversations, the hospitality expectations, the bumper stickers were all different. No recycling and styrofoam was everywhere. I don't think I've seen a eating establishment give out styrofoam cups since the early 90s, but there they were. A few years ago I flew from Pittsburgh to Miami in the middle of winter. It was nearly 0 degrees outside when I got on the plane and I was bundled up tight. When we landed in Florida it was like 80 degrees. Everyone was walking around in shorts and t-shirts. People were lounging on the beach in bikinis and swimming in the ocean. I had never been to Florida before and was not at all expecting such a difference. It was a huge juxtaposition to what I was experiencing just a few hours earlier. It's so disconcerting to step off the plane and suddenly it's summer. What's even more amazing is how quickly you get used to it, and how that does not work the other way around when you go home. Depends on where you're going and how you get there. Going from any non-huge city to NYC, culture shock. Flying from anywhere to Hawaii, culture shock. Although in the best way. Driving from say Illinois to Florida, not so much because driving eases the transition, but also because other than the ocean and some palm trees, it's really not that different. It's not like in Europe where you can have a country next door that's wildly different from you in every way. Our cities mostly look and act similar. It's just little things like the attitude of the people, the weather, the plant life, the nature features, etc. There are a few exceptions like I mentioned, but I've never experienced true culture shock here other than NYC. I moved from Illinois to Florida via driving and there was definitely a cultural difference. It might not be as stark as other places, but it was a noticeable and welcome change. The only culture shock I ever really experience is when I go to buy beer liquor and discover I'm on one of those wacky states with loony laws. Real examples I've seen that flabbergasted me. At a grocery store. Oh, you're buying beer and food? You'll have to ring the beer up separately and take it out a different door. At a grocery store in a different state, you can't buy beer in grocery stores. At a brewery, we can't legally let you order a flight. You can order 2 tasters at a time as many times as you want. Would you like to pre-order your next round and I'll drop it off as soon as you finish these? At a brewery, yes, we sell beer to go, but you can't take it out the front door. You have to go out the employee exit and back and keep it in a brown paper bag until you get to your car. At a restaurant bar, oh, you want bar seating? That's over there behind that curtain. Trying to find a liquor store? Oh, you have to go to a state-run store. But there are only 4 in the entire state and the closest one is 100 miles from here. You better hurry, they close at 6. At brewery, sorry, state law says you can't play games or watch TV while drinking craft beer. Considering that I live in a state where pretty much any type of business that wants to sell alcohol, grocery stores, hardware stores, bookshops, clothing stores, etc. And you can buy however much you want, any day of the week, and pretty much any time except the wee hours of the morning. Trying to find a good drink in some of those other states is a culture shock. There are certain spots that are just completely different from everywhere else, but for the most part, the culture shock is between urban-rural areas, which you will find even within a state, but it's not comparable to say, between countries in Europe. As a South Carolinian who has lived in a lot of different states, here's what I noticed. They don't serve cold tea in December outside the South, and if you order iced tea from a place that actually has it, they probably won't serve it pre-sweetened. Weak cold bitter water is not refreshing, so I learned to drink plain water or maybe lemonade to get my sugar fix. I started drinking a lot more coffee for caffeine. Barbecue served in states not famous for their barbecue will be covered in sicky sweet ketchup. Don't order it unless you're at a highly recommended barbecue joint. The sketchier the better. Grits aren't standard breakfast food outside the South, let alone reconfigured for every meal, and most white Americans don't serve everything over either rice or grits. Manners are different in different regions. In some places, the rudest thing you can do is waste someone's time. In others, not acknowledging someone's existence is the height of tackiness, but people are just as willing to help you anywhere. Other people don't call shopping carts buggies, and some Yankees will fight you for calling all carbonated sugar water Coke. But only buttholes will pretend not to understand that tennis shoes and sneakers are the same dang thing. Also, fixing to isn't a common way to say about to outside the South, and people will laugh at you for using it. They'll actually just laugh at disparage your accent and dialect more generally. She crab soup and hop in Jonna to SC what white barbecue sauce is to Al or coffee milk is to RI. A delicious but very local delicacy. Actually, I am glad my mom taught me how to cook, because a lot of what I eat every day just isn't a thing in the rest of America, or it's made so differently as to not resemble what I'm used to. The biggest shock for me was discovering that black people really do make up a minority of the population in many parts of the country. It was kind of uncanny valley to be in a grocery store and not see as many black faces as white. I'm from the low country and moved to the Midlands. Whenever I travel outside of SC or the Southeast, it is astonishing to not see that many black people. It feels oddly gentrified and divided. Here, everyone is pretty evenly represented in public. There isn't particularly strong culture lines based on the state lines. Culture varies a bit more once you look at larger areas though. I've lived in Ohio, Wisconsin and Minnesota and haven't had any culture shock. My brother who moved to Los Angeles did though. Think someone in this thread said it best. There isn't necessarily cultural differences between states, but there can be between regions and between rural and urban. If you go to the coastal states from the central states, it's a whole other country. If you go to extreme south from extreme north, it's very different. But for the most part, in the middle the accents change a bit, but we're all just people going about our normal lives. If I go from a city in the United States to a city on the other side of the country, the culture shock is not very large. Some accents, some changes in local eateries, some changes in the specific reason why the local drivers are literally the worst drivers in the country, but nothing that feels shocking. Now, if you go to a different city and then get in a car and drive an hour outside of town, there is culture shock. I feel much more out of place, in a way that I distinctly don't feel an hour outside of my own city. The funny thing is, when I return from a faraway rural area back to its nearby city, the differences that I already noticed in the city make more sense. There are differences between regions, but they're more muted in large cities. I live in Virginia and my dad lives in California, so the first time I visited it was way different. Where I live everyone smiles at each other and says hi and stuff like that, and when I smiled I would get weird looks and would get weird looks in general with him since he has red hair and blue eyes and I'm obviously biracial. You can only tell they're related if you actually look at our features. The traffic was absolutely awful, and the Walmarts had everything locked up depending on where you were shopping, and that isn't at all what it's like where I live. There's other things as well, but those are what come to mind. When I went to New York when I was younger, it wasn't too much of a culture shock. People were super nice. It was just very fast paced compared to where I lived. But other than those two places, that's about it. It just depends on where you're from and where you go. When I first moved to Texas for college from New Jersey, I visited a Whataburger. I mentioned it was my first time in Texas to the cashier, and he literally shook my hand and welcomed me to the state. People waved from across the street with their whole hands, and not just their middle fingers. It was beautiful. The biggest differences I see are yard decorations, regional fast food outlets, and convenience stores, and package stores, ice houses, or whatever. They all have local snacks and drinks like goo-goo clusters, pulled pork in a crock pot, or big red soda. Store setup is usually different by state, too. Picnic tables, tables and chairs, or nothing for eating outside. Oh, and lottery tickets that are cheesy, but in a different cheesy than your state. Not usually, but you can definitely see differences in people's attitudes. We moved from Illinois to the Boston area and I was working as a restaurant manager. I would apply my typical Midwestern friendliness, but the people on the East Coast just didn't get it until they got used to it. I would walk through the dining room and ask if I can take people's trays out of their way for them, and people would straight up ask me why I want their trash. Then we moved back to Illinois and now to Texas, and the people here are sometimes over the top friendly. Before COVID hit and we would go out to eat, it wasn't out of the question to have a table near you strike up a conversation with you. My brother and I were driving through middle of nowhere northern Louisiana on our way to Florida once, and we saw a prisoner chain gang, white guard on a horse with a shotgun, maybe 10-15 prisoners, all black, out in a field picking cotton. I asked my brother if we had accidentally traveled 150 years into the past. You'll probably pass near Angola State Penitentiary. It used to be a plantation but turned into a prison, so it basically stayed the same. As a non-American, I'm sure it must feel different. England feels drastically different between London's East versus Merseyside versus Northeast, and the entire UK fits inside Texas multiple times over. That's 3 1/3 countries combined that equal the size of Czechs, Oregon. It'd be surprising if there weren't some noticeable differences even within states. You get more of a shock going rural to metropolitan, and can do that without leaving a state. I grew up in a rural farming area, live in a small urban area now. There was some adjustments but I got used to it. Going to Manhattan or Philadelphia is a huge change. It's a totally different experience. Just the sheer amount of people, which leads into traffic patterns while trying to drive. I live in coastal Maine. Many tourists from all over the world and the US are shocked by how green everything is. Green as in there are trees everywhere. I never really understood that, because everywhere has trees, but since traveling around a bit I now understand why some people were so shocked. We don't have highways everywhere. Only certain main streets are illuminated with street lights while most other roads don't have any. The air is very clean compared to other states, and yes, there are way more freaking trees here than any other state I've been around casually. And I guess the seafood is nice lol. I'm in the dusty, brown, flat part of Texas, and my wife is a New Englander. When we go visit her family, we always try to drive up and spend a few days in Portland or Kennebunk. Don't ever take the green and the water for granted. Oh my gosh, yes. Especially the food. I live in Cape Cod, Mass now, and I was living in Philadelphia, PA before. I would never get a cheesesteak here, just like I'd never buy a lobster roll in Philly. Depends on which state you're going to. Some states have a very distinct feel, like New Mexico or Louisiana, which have a pretty distinct cuisine and culture that you don't find in other states. I think it's also about urban non-urban. I live near Chicago, and Indiana definitely feels different, but so does downstate Illinois. I would say much of downstate Illinois has more in common with Indiana or Iowa than it does with the Chicago area. I don't feel as much of a cultural change going to Milwaukee as I do going to Peoria, for example. Some observations from my travels. In the border towns in Texas, I have generally been greeted in Spanish at sit-down and fast food restaurants. English is the second language down there. Most everyone is brown Hispanic. New York has some of the most attractive business class looking people I've seen, just very well put together and fit. What stands out about Alabama and other southern states is how nicely dressed everyone is. The women wear nice floral sundresses and the men have nice haircuts and button-up shirts. There's an Alabama look that can be described as outdoorsy below the belt and dressed up above the belt. Blue jeans, cowboy boots, a button-up shirt and sweater vest with a ball cap. You can spot an Alabama man from a distance sporting this style. Wisconsiners are probably the friendliest bunch. They'd be most likely to make friends with a complete stranger and invite them to a barbecue. Southerners are the most polite, but keep you at a distance. You almost have to marry into the culture to feel like you're really one of them. Rhode Island has its own names for everyday things. It shares the Boston accent, which is hands down the best drinking at a bar accent. Seattle was so cloudy every time I've been there that it feels dark and surprisingly claustrophobic with the hills and trees. If you want some depressing entertainment, go to the McDonald's in downtown Seattle and watch the drug addicts. Best brightest city I've ever been to is Charleston, SC. That place is cool, great history, architecture and food. Moved from Chicago area to SC, Texas in 1981. Huge culture shock, accents, honky tonks, frontage roads, giving shoulder, big hair, gun racks, made great friends. Still visit since moving away 34 years ago. I live in Texas, but my whole life have visited family in upstate New York. I would say it is completely different but not a huge shock. Everyone speaks their mind in New York because people get less offended by what you say. They have a totally different accent. Less accent than most Texans. They don't know what having BBQ means. They just cook on the barbecue grill sometimes. This may be just where I was specifically, but once I was old enough to drink, the gas station workers seemed very judgmental when I bought a 6-pack. Coke is not a generic term for soda up there. They call it pop. There are a lot of differences, so I would say there might be culture shock. Most places in NY say soda. Pop is a Buffalo Rochester thing. When I was 4 years old, I cried inconsolably because we were taking a family trip to Rhode Island and I thought I wouldn't speak the language there. To cheer me up, my dad taught me to speak with a New England accent and then assured me I was fluent. It depends on how far out you go. Pennsylvania to New Jersey would have much less of a culture shock than probably going to Texas or California. But it also depends if you live in an urban or suburban area. I didn't when I used to live in California, but we're in Alaska now, and going back to California definitely feels like a culture shock. It's so busy and materialistic, it definitely takes me a few days to get sorted and readjust. As an old guy, it used to be a significant culture shock to travel between states. Today, not so much. Apart from the likes of NYC and San Francisco, everywhere is pretty much the same. What with the Gap, Starbucks, fast food places, etc. The interstate highway system also changed things up as you longer went through communities. I live in Texas, so there's definitely a culture shock in any direction. West is New Mexico with a beautiful blending of American Indian and Spanish vibe. A trip east leads to Louisiana and the French Canadian or Cajun ambience. South is the country of Mexico, which is beautiful and amazing for so many reasons. But north to Oklahoma is the biggest culture shock of all because it's like going back in time to American in the 1950s. I live in CO, and there are so many people who move here from around the country. We have a booming tech industry in my area specifically, that when I visited Boston last year it didn't really feel that different to me. Folks say that people here are super friendly, but when I visited Boston I didn't think people were rude, just efficient with their time and commuting. That and the slightly older history were the biggest differences. In CO, something from the mid-late 1800s is really old. Going to Boston and seeing stuff that dates to the late 1700s and earlier was super cool. Not the same as when I visited Rome and saw things that were thousands of years old, but still different from home. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.